بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. اللهم افتح علينا حكمتك وانشر علينا رحمتك يا ذا الجلال والإكرام. وصل اللهم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الكرام. ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. الحمد لله. First of all, I want to thank all of you, especially those who have come from the royal families and honored us by your presence here, which shows your humility and also the respect that your culture shows to scholarship. So thank you very much, Queen Tunku Aziza, Amina Maimuna, Queen Raja Zara Sophia, and the members of your family. I want to first of all say that this is my latest visit to really a country that I've come to love. Malaysia is a beautiful country. I consider it in some ways an outlier in the Muslim world, which is going through an incredible amount of disruption and difficulty. We have several places where Muslims are living in extraordinarily difficult conditions, and this has led, unfortunately, to a lot of confusion. There are many Muslims that have become confused. This is not the first time in our ummah that we've suffered a major crisis. When the Mongol invasion occurred in the Muslim lands, it was an incredible disruption of Muslim civilization and culture, which had reached an extraordinary level of culture and civilization. The Muslims had routes of commerce that extended into China and through what was known as the Silk Route. The Muslims had very, very high levels of civilization and culture, and the disruption that it caused created a lot of confusion, not dissimilar to the time that we're in. In fact, Athiruddin, one of the great historians of the Islamic tradition, said that since the creation of Adam until now, there hadn't been a greater crisis in the Muslim world than what occurred with the Mongol invasion. But within a short time, in 1256, Baraka Khan, actually the first Mongol prince, embraced Islam and actually became a great defender of the Muslim tradition. So this is one of the extraordinary aspects of our faith, is people who came into the Muslim lands were often overwhelmed by the incredible culture and civilization, and in the case of the Mongols, actually adopted it and then ended up becoming great defenders. The Ilkhanid dynasty actually renewed Islam in many ways. And if you read T.V. Arnold's The Preaching of Islam, he was a Christian minister who looked at the spread of Islam and was struck by the fact that the Muslims did not spread their religion by the sword. In fact, although they did conquer in the early period certain countries, nonetheless, they always allowed for religious freedom and for people to worship as they saw fit. In fact, Juan Cole, an extraordinary scholar of Islam from the United States, recently wrote a book called Muhammad, Muhammad, the Prophet of Peace amidst a clash of empire. And in that book, he makes a very compelling argument that the Prophet ﷺ, at the core of his mission, was the desire to engender an environment that enabled people to freely worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to freely worship what they believed, and to make the world safe for both religious freedom and for commerce. And he makes an argument that the Prophet ﷺ, because he was living at a time when there was what we would call today really a world war, by the amount of people that were affected by it in that region. And this was the great war between the Sassanid Persian Empire and between the Byzantine Empire. The Prophet ﷺ witnessed that war and actually sided with the Byzantines, wanted them to be the victors over the Persians who were pagans. So he saw the people of the book as closer to the Muslims than the pagans. So he actually wanted to see a world where a woman could travel, and this is what he said, that his religion would reach a point where a woman could travel from Syria to Yemen and fear nothing but the wolf on the road. In other words, it would be a civil society, a place where people could worship freely, could trade and have commerce, and not have to worry about being attacked or being harmed. And this is one of the hallmarks of a civil society, is that people are not in need of weapons. They don't have to carry a sword or a dagger or a gun or a rifle. That they actually live in a society where they feel safe and secure. This is one of the great blessings of this place that we're in now. And people should be aware of that blessing, because one of the hallmarks of ingratitude is a type of heedlessness about the blessings that one finds oneself in. And the Quran reminds us again and again about the dangers of ingratitude, about the dangers of being ingrates. In fact, the word in Arabic for kafir, which we use for a disbeliever, the linguistic meaning is the one who covers over or who hides or who conceals, and it meant to conceal gratitude, to conceal what the blessings that one should be grateful for. So this is very important. Now, if you look at the current crisis, and I want to talk a little bit about why we're in the crisis that we're in. I'm in California. I became Muslim in 1977, and I began to study Islam very seriously. I went to the Middle East, and I studied in the United Arab Emirates. I had the fortune of having a scholarship there, and then I went to North Africa and then West Africa, and then I went back to the United States and studied in the university. That in studying Islam, I came across a lot of different views and approaches, because modernity has brought many, many different ways of viewing religion. And so there are certain strains or ideologies that emerged within our community that were alien to the traditional worldview. And in looking at those, I myself had a hard time working out what was the best way to approach this religion. But I did understand that I needed to learn Arabic, because Arabic seemed to me to enable somebody to access the source books of the religion. And so I set about to learn Arabic, and I was fortunate in having very good teachers. And I came across West Africans who were really the only people that I found personally that had, in essence, what I would call a pre-modern understanding of Islam, an understanding of Islam that was not impacted or affected by colonialism. And that's no longer the case in Mauritania, but when I was studying there, it was certainly the case. In the Mauritanians that I had the good fortune of studying with, these were people that were looking at the Islamic tradition through the lens of pre-modern eyes. And they were not affected by the changes and the transformations that had occurred in other places in the Muslim world, including the sources of their Islam, places like Morocco and Tunisia. So in studying and discovering a tradition, I found a tradition that I thought was incredibly rich, and in some ways similar to the tradition that I had grown up with my father, who was a liberal artist and somebody who was very committed to the Western scholastic tradition. But one of the people that I discovered in my search was a Malay scholar, Sayyidina Qibr Atas. And Sayyidina Qibr Atas, the first book that I read of his was called Secularism in Islam. And I found this book to be a stunning analysis of what went wrong. And I think, and I've been Muslim now for 42 years, and I can say with a great deal of conviction that Sayyidina Ibn Atas is probably the greatest influence on my understanding of the crises in the Muslim world, and also on what needs to be done in order to heal that crisis. And he's had a huge impact on me. I've been reading his books consistently for the last almost 40 years. I first discovered them in England in 1978. And it just amazes me that this man has been here in this country, and the people that he has impacted and influenced, his influence now has reached America. And I can say with pride for Malaysia that our students are required to read his text, the Prolegomena, that our students who graduated this year, several of them wrote their capstone senior theses on Sayyidina Ibn Atas's work. So Malaysia is a significant country intellectually for the Muslim community around the world. And I think increasingly Sayyidina Ibn Atas's thought will be seen for what it is, as extraordinarily insightful and in many ways diagnostically what the community needs to understand in order to set about and heal our beleaguered ummah. Sayyidina Qib, I think, reduces his argument down to a very simple understanding. He believes that at the root of the crises is what he calls confusion about knowledge, which has led to a loss of adab. And these two, confusion about knowledge and a loss of adab, has led to the rise of false leadership. This is not dissimilar to the diagnoses that Imam al-Ghazali, the great mujaddid of Islam, during his time, and probably the only mujaddid in the history of Islam who was a renewer in the three areas of Islam: jurisprudence, theology, and spirituality. Imam al-Ghazali argued also during his time that there was a crisis of knowledge. And in his book, Ihya Ulum ad-Din, he sets about to rectify this crisis. And the very first book in that is called Kitab al-Ilm, the book of knowledge, because this is where he believed the change had to occur, because it was ignorance that caused the crisis in the first place. Imam al-Ghazali, radiallahu anhu, says that corruption is the source of our crises on this planet. This word fasad in Arabic, which can mean many different things, but essentially it means corruption. This is found in several places in the Quran. In fact, the angels in Surah Al-Baqarah, when they ask God about the wisdom of placing human beings on the earth, the question that they ask is, أَتَجْعَلُ فِيهَا مَنْ يُفْسِدُ فِيهَا? Will you place in the earth the one who sows corruption in the earth? وَيَسْفِكُ الدِّمَاء, and sheds blood, which is the worst form of corruption. And the angels, they want to understand. This is called su'al al-istifham, la su'al al-i'tirab. It's a question in order to understand, not a question to object. And so, in saying that, they're recognizing that the human being is a problematic creature, that this corruption is an aspect of the human species. So Imam al-Ghazali identified the areas of corruption that he felt were most significant, and the very first one was jahal, was ignorance itself. That human beings without knowledge do an immense amount of damage, or if their knowledge is corrupted, which is another type of ignorance. So for instance, he says, when knowledge moves towards worldly things and forgets otherworldly matters, then this creates a major crisis in the human being. The second thing that he identified as a source of corruption was hubb dunya, the love of dunya. And by dunya, dunya in the Quran has to do with the life of this world. Because the human being's pursuits are basically what he calls qut, kiswa, and maskan. We need sustenance, we need garments to protect ourselves, and then we need basic living conditions. But he says the obsession with these things leads to the distraction in the world. So for instance, we lose ourselves. And this is something that he said, another phenomenon that emerges because of this corruption is the loss of our knowledge of our own selves, of our own hearts. We forget ourselves. And the reason why this is so dangerous is because we're on the doors of infinity according to our faith. We're being told that all of this short period that we're here in the world is in preparation for an infinite journey, a journey into infinity. And for that reason, the self has to be preoccupied with the infinite. In other words, what we do here should be in relation to what is coming. One of the great philosophers of Europe, Soren Kierkegaard, in a book he wrote called Sickness Unto Death, he says, the most hazardous thing, the most dangerous thing to lose oneself occurs very quietly in the world. One can lose oneself without hardly noticing it. And then he says, if he loses anything else, an arm, a leg, $5, a wife, he'll notice it. But he can lose his self and not even notice it. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, إِنَّ الْخَاسِرِينَ الَّذِينَ خَسِرُوا أَنفُسَهُم. The real losers are the ones who've lost themselves. The ones that have lost themselves. Because they forget that the purpose of their life is to prepare for what's coming. And what's coming is infinity. And so this is a huge crisis that the human being finds him or herself in. And then we preoccupy ourselves with all of these different things, all of these different distractions, and we're living in the age of distractibility. Human beings are more distracted today than any time in our history. And we have more ways of distracting ourselves. And so if we lose ourselves, نَسُوا اللَّهَ فَأَنْسَاهُمْ أَنفُسَهُم, they forgot God, and so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala caused them to forget themselves. Because the only way that you will remember yourself is by remembering who created you. By remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you become aware of who you are. Without knowing that, you're lost and don't know who you are. Now, one of the major crises in our community is this crisis of knowledge, which is absolutely, what is knowledge in the first place? Because there's outward knowledges, there's inward knowledges, there's worldly knowledges, there's otherworldly knowledges. Our Quran talks about the people who know يَعْلَمُونَ ظَاهِرًا مِنَ الْحَيَةِ الدُّنْيَا وَهُمْ عَنِ الْآخِرَةِ هُمْ غَافِلُونَ. Those people who know the outward of this world, and it's not for anything that is in the chapter on the Europeans, Rome, who are clearly in the hadith tradition referring not just to the Byzantines but to Rome, the Europeans. The Quran says they know the outward knowledges of this world, but as for the other world, they're in heedlessness. And this is one of the things about, if you look at the Dajjalic phenomenon towards the latter days, the Dajjal is the antichristic element. In other words, if you look at the teaching of Jesus, the teaching of Jesus is largely about becoming detached from this world so that you can be in the world but not of it. The Dajjalic worldview is to invert that. So you actually forget the other world. And so people now have become so preoccupied with this world that they've forgotten that there's another world. And this is a great tragedy. And so with this confusion about knowledge, with this confusion about the self, we find ourselves in a major crisis. And then on top of that, we have all of these permutations, these perversions that emerge, not just in our own community, these perversions of extremism. And extremism goes two ways. We have religious extremism, and then we have the extremism of lack of religion in our community. So the Muslims can go astray both ways. It's not just the extremism, the religious extremism, but also the extremism of the lack of religion and concern for religion. Even though we know that religion is the foundation of our cultures, it's the foundations of our civilizations. In fact, arguably, religion, there is no civilization without religion. We've never had in human history a civilization that didn't emerge out of some sense of the sacred and didn't create some sense of hierarchy, from the Greek hieros arche, the rule of the sacred. And so part of the modern impulse now is to remove hierarchy, which means even removing and destroying the basis of a family, which is hierarchical by its nature. And this is one of the things that our Muslim communities have to be very careful about, because we're seeing the collapse of family in many places now, especially in Western Europe and America. There's a breakdown of family. And in the Muslim world, we still have strong families. We have family ties. We have the relationships of family, of nasab and musahara, of the lineage, and of intermarriage and these things. These are very important. If we lose these things, we lose everything. Because the foundation of a healthy society is the healthy family. They are the atoms that make up the aggregate of a society. And so without that, there's a huge crisis. So this is one of the things. And we have to understand, if we don't understand where these ideas are coming from that are now infiltrating our communities, if we don't understand the philosophical positions behind these ideas, we will be completely lost. So just as an example, in the West, there's a powerful philosophical force which does not believe that there are any essences to things. Now, some people can think this is a rarefied philosophical idea and something for ivory towers. But that actually, down on the ground, becomes extremely dangerous, because people, for instance, say that there is no essential self. There's no binaries. These are what they call social constructs. And so you have the idea, for instance, that the male or the female is a social construct. Gender is a construct. Biological sex is determined by your genetic makeup, by whether you have X and Y or XX chromosomes. But there is now a very powerful force working in the West to argue that gender is a social construct, that you behave like a male or a female based on your enculturation, that these are not based on anything that is essential to the human being. So this is a philosophical idea that's now having a huge impact on our culture. So in my state, you have now people coming into grade school classrooms and telling students that they don't have to be a male or a female if they don't want to. They can choose what they want to. This is actually happening right now. And you will see this increasingly affecting your societies. So the Muslims themselves has to understand where these ideas come from, and then they also have to have an understanding of why these things are wrong. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran says, Subhanalladhi khalaqa al-azwaja kullaha. Glory be to the one who created everything in binaries. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the male and the female. Inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa untha. We created you from a male and a female. وَجَعَلَ مِنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ أَزْوَاجًا, and we made from yourselves mates, pairs. A zawj is an opposite. And this is why we understand marriage to be between a male and a female. These are essential to our religion. We can't alter this religion. لَا تُبَدِّلُوا نِعْمَةَ اللَّهِ. Do not change the blessing of Allah. Meaning this gift that He's given us, which is guidance. And so guidance is absolutely essential. We cannot survive without guidance as a human species. And this is where revelation becomes so important. You can have reason, but reason divorced from revelation leads to the gulag. It leads to the Holocaust. They have a problem. They see an alien group in their society that they feel is corrupting and corrosive. And so rationally, they determine we need to exterminate this. And then they set up means of doing that. This comes out of reason without revelation, because there's nothing to tell them that that's wrong. You can't ground morality without some sense of the divine. You can create laws, but those laws are simply the decisions of the people running those societies. And so when the Nazis were in power, everything they did was legal according to their laws. That was their argument at Nuremberg. But who's to say they were wrong? The only way that we can determine in truth that they were wrong is when we have something that transcends the human being, that tells the human being what is right and what is wrong. Because right now, what's being taught all over this world is a type of moral relativism, and so our young people are confused because they're told that what's right for you isn't necessarily right for me. But our tradition, the tradition of revelation, says no. There are specific, determinate things that are right and wrong. And this is something that if we don't hold on to it, if we don't preserve it, and if we don't transmit it, we will lose it, like many societies have lost their way. Now, the other major problem when you have, when you're looking at the crises, you have a problem of worldview. In other words, every science, in the broadest sense of that term, has embedded with it a worldview. And so even though certain things, facts are not knowledge. Facts are the objects of knowledge, but they are not knowledge themselves. Knowledge involves a holistic understanding of the world. And this is why we have ilm and we have ma'rifah. We have knowledge and then we have the wisdom that enables us to work with that knowledge. So we have a crisis of worldview because, for instance, Western science has embedded with it a metaphysical view that is assumed but rarely ever articulated or spoken about. You can find critics and you can find proponents of it. People like Stephen Hawking, for instance, or somebody. There are a few of these people that are very well known globally. These people understand exactly what the presumptions of their sciences are, and they will articulate them. But most people are unaware of that. So if you look, for instance, in science, you have facts. Those facts are the same everywhere. The laws of physics that you learn in China are the same laws of physics that are taught in California or Malaysia. But what you do with those laws of physics will be determined by your worldview. This is what's important. And so even though sciences have an aspect that is universal, embedded in those sciences is a worldview that's going to change the way you look at the world and what you do. When the Muslims were at the height of their powers, much of what they did was for the good of humanity. We know this, and we have many things to be proud of. The West has used power in a very devastating way in many places. And this is not to deny the extraordinary gifts of the West, because there are many, and many. We're sitting in many of them. A lot of these discoveries came from Western people, and so there are many great things that come from the West. But there are also many devastating aspects because of the separation of reason and revelation that's occurred in the West. In the Muslim world, the opposite in many ways has happened. We have moved away from the rational sciences, and within our Islamic tradition, focused on the religious sciences and divorced them. And traditionally, these were wedded together, aql and naql, reason and revelation. And both are absolutely essential to have a vibrant Islam. And so when you have civilizational challenges and you don't have intellectual responses to those challenges, you, as a civilization, find yourself with your back up against the wall. And this is a crisis that we're in. And so how do we remedy that crisis? The first thing is to have a diagnosis. And that's where I think your great teacher and our great teacher has so much to tell us about the crises that we're in. And we have an immense amount to learn from him. Now, in this society here, and I'll just conclude with a few remarks. In this society here in Malaysia, you have something that has been lost in many places in the world, and it's very important that you hold on to it. And that is, you still have an immense respect in your society. This is a society of adab. And we see it, we experience it. Those of us who visit you, we feel it. You might not be aware of it. There's the story of the fish, the two young fish that are swimming in the water, and they pass by an old fish. And the old fish says, "How's the waters, lads?" And the fish swim a little ways away, the guppies, and they turn to one another and say, "What's water?" That is what happens when you're immersed in a culture or a society. You're often unaware of what you have until you lose it. And so it's very important to be aware of what you have here. There are many gifts here, and I want to see this society preserved and prospering. And so you have to hold on to that, an awareness of how important that is. The other thing that you have, which is very important, is you have a religious tradition. There are ideas coming into Malaysia from outside Malaysia that are not intrinsic to this society. Your tradition is an extraordinary tradition. You have a tradition rooted in a Ghazalian view of Islam. And this is a beautiful vision of Islam, and you have to preserve it and protect it. It's extremely important that you hold on to it and that you not lose that. Because there are many ideas in the Muslim world that are coming in. Many of them came out of a desire to rectify what clearly went wrong. That's undeniable. And it's not to question the sincerity of some of the people that put forward these ideas. But these ideas are very often alien to our tradition. Another thing that you have is you have government that's functioning. You have a complex state now. Malaysia is no longer the type of society that it was when Islam first came. It was a much simpler society, and we can look back on that nostalgically. But now you are in most places, especially in the cities of Malaysia, you are an extremely complex and sophisticated society. And for that reason, you have to respect the importance of government. And people people accuse me somehow of supporting governments. I had somebody once say to me in Arabic, لماذا تؤيد النظام? Why do you support? Nizam is one of the ways Arabics say government. But nizam in Arabic means order. And so I said to him, أنا أؤيد النظام لغة. I support the nizam linguistically. In other words, in its linguistic meaning. I support order. I don't want to see chaos. And when government breaks down, things fall apart. And so just, if you look at our tradition, one of the most important things in our tradition is this idea of respecting order and respecting the governments. And so I just want to read something from one of my favorite authors, Sidi Ahmed Zarruq, about this. He says, مواقع التقلب وهي بساط الأدب, that you have to guard yourself against those things that can turn things upside down. And this is an area that involves the idea of adab, kabir al-walidain, like respecting your parents. If you lose respect for your parents, this creates a chaos in a society. kabir al-walidain, wujuban, والمعلم كذلك وندبا وطاعة الأمراء فيما لم يخالف الشرع. And also respect for your teachers, the parent, the teacher, and then he says obedience to your governments. فيما لم يخالف الشرع, as long as what they're commanding you to do is not in contradistinction to sacred law. And this is hearing and obeying. وَإِنْ كَانَ عَبْدًا حَبَشِيًّا. And then this is not a racist remark, but it's saying even if it was a servant from Ethiopia, because for the Arabs, the servants of Ethiopia were under them. And so the Prophet ﷺ said, if you were in a situation, even if it was an Ethiopian servant who was in power now, you should obey them. And then Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu said, "In shatamaka fasbir." If they speak ill of you, be patient. وَإِن ضَرَبَكَ فَاصْبِرْ. If they strike you, be patient. وَإِن أَخَذَ مَالَكَ فَاصْبِرْ. وَإِن رَاوَدَكَ عَلَى دِينِكَ فَقُلْ طَعْتٌ مِنِّي ذِمَّتِي دُونَ دِينِي. And if they take your wealth, meaning taxes and things like that, be patient. And if they attempt to seduce you away from your religion, say, my obedience to you is my responsibility, but to my deen, this is between me and Allah. And so, if they try to take away your religion, we don't obey them in that. And then he quotes, the Messenger of Allah said, "Isma' wa ati', hear and obey. وَإِن ضَرَبَ ظَهْرَ وَأَخَذَ الْمَالِ." Even if there's some violence against, because the state uses violence sometimes, and takes your wealth, taxes and things like that. The people don't like to give their wealth to governments. قال صلوات الله وتعالى وسلامه عليه أعطوهم ما سألوا وحسابهم على الله. Give them what they ask of you, and their reckoning is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وقال عليه الصلاة والسلام ما مشى قوم إلى سلطان شبرا ليذلوه إلا أذلهم الله. That no people will move towards government, even a handspan, to humiliate them, except Allah will humiliate them. This is our tradition. I'm not making this up. And this was not done to keep population subdued. If governments use it for that reason, that's possible. But this is our religion. And this is what our scholars have taught. And this is what is in all of our books. If you read Nasihat al-Muluk, all of these books, this is what they teach. And then he said, مَا سَبَّ قَوْمٌ أَمِيرُهُمْ إِلَّا حُرِمَ خَيْرُهُ. No people curse their rulers except they're deprived of the good of those rulers. In another hadith, الْمُؤْمِنُ لَا يُذِلُّ نَفْسَهُ. A believer should never humiliate themselves. They said, Ya Rasulullah, how would a believer humiliate themselves? By opposing government who wouldn't be fair to them. In other words, don't put yourself in a situation of rebellion where the government will end up destroying you. Now finally, and this is in the Hilya of Abu Nu'aym, and this is taken from previous tradition, but it's very interesting. Abu Nu'aym is a muhaddith and one of the great scholars of Islam. He said in the earlier books, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed, Ana Allah, la ilaha illa ana, مالك الملك قلوب الملوك بيدي فمن أطاعني جعلته عليه رحمة ومن عصاني جعلت عليه نقمة جعلتهم عليه نقمة فلا تشغلوا أنفسكم بسبهم وادعوني أعطفهم عليكم. It says, I am Allah, there is no God but I alone. I am the possessor of all dominion. The hearts of the rulers are in my hand. Whoever obeys me, I will make them a mercy for you. Whoever obeys me, I will make the rulers a mercy for you. And whoever disobeys me, I will make them a punishment for you. So do not preoccupy yourselves with cursing your rulers, but rather preoccupy yourselves with calling on me, and I will change their hearts towards you. I mean, that is an incredible, different view. This is what you find in our books. Abu Bakr al-Tartushi, who avoided rulers, he avoided government. He had nothing to do with governments. He was an extremely pious man, wrote a book called Siraj al-Muluk, which is advice to rulers. But in that book, he says, people say, why aren't the rulers like Abu Bakr and Omar? And he said, the rulers have as much right to say, why aren't the citizens or the subjects like Abu Bakr and Omar? Right? So this is very important. All governments have problems. There's no government that does not have problems. All governments have some levels of corruption. The better the government, the less corruption. But there's always problems because you put people in positions of power. Power often corrupts people. This is simply the fact. The best governments are the ones that are vigilant about these things and will take people to account. But this idea is very important to understand, that if you want to change your conditions, you have to change yourselves. I recently saw a cartoon, and it had a politician. There was a crowd of people, and the politician said, "Who wants change?" And the whole crowd shouts, "We do!" And then the politician said, "Who wants to change?" And nobody said anything. And this is exactly the human problem. We want to change our leaders and the people in power over us, but we don't want to change our conditions. كَمَا تَكُونُونَ يُوَلَّ عَلَيْكُمْ. As you are, so the people put over you. Abu Bakr al-Tartushi, in the same book I recently quoted, Siraj al-Muluk, says, I heard this hadith, it's a weak hadith, but it's used in many books. I heard this hadith and I thought about this hadith, and I said, and then I found it in the Quran. كَذَلِكَ نُوَلِّي بَعْضَ الظَّالِمِينَ بَعْضًا. Like that, we put some oppressors over other oppressors because of what they were earning. This is the human condition. إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِقَوْمٍ حَتَّى يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِأَنفُسِهِمْ. Allah will not change a people until they change what's in themselves. Look at the formation of those words, because this is basically a condition, and the condition is fulfilled when you fulfill the condition put upon you. Allah says in the Quran, Allah will not change the conditions of a people until they change what's in their souls. That's the formula. And this is a different view. This is a bottom-up view as opposed to a top-down view. There are many Muslims now that argue ideologically that if we just can get rid of the government, then everything is going to work out. We have seen over and over again what happens when you remove governments. And if you don't think governments are a blessing, my challenge to you is to find somebody living in a place where there's no government, and you ask them whether or not government is a blessing. Ask the people of Libya whether a government is a blessing. Ask the people of Yemen whether a government is a blessing. Ask the people of Syria whether a government is a blessing. Imam Malik ibn Anas said, and Ibn Taymiyyah reiterates this, that 60 years of an oppressive rule is better than a day of anarchy when there's raping and pillaging. This is a real problem in our community. And so that's something that I really want to drive home, is that you have a blessing in civil society here. Hold on to that blessing. The way you hold on to that blessing is being grateful for it. If you're grateful, I will increase you. If you want to change the conditions of your society, you have to work from the grassroots, changing the morality of the people, getting them closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the methodology of prophets. This is the methodology of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. When he came into Mecca as a conqueror, he did not abase the people that were previously in power. This is what a normal human being would do. When he came into Mecca, he took the people that had fought him for 20 years and he honored them. He said, "Man dakhala bayta Abi Sufyan kana amina." Whoever enters into the house of Abu